Hi, I'm Eric and I'm back with another video. It's Thursday afternoon, August 14th, one day before the big day. Donald Trump, the emperor of the world, is going to meet Vladimir Putin of Russia. So everybody is wondering what's going to happen. And I'm going to talk about that in connection with some broader topics. The topic that I really want to talk about actually is ignorance. Last weekend I had coffee with a friend of mine, an Israeli friend of mine, and now we're both practicing Buddhists, and the thing about Buddhism is, what is it? The ostensible purpose of it is to free ourselves from suffering. And how do you do that? There's a question that I think all mankind has been asking that. I mean, even Nietzsche, the German philosopher, said that the greatest society is the society that reduces suffering the most. So this is a universal question. And the core issue, as according to Buddhist theory, is that it's ignorance. It's not knowing. Ignorance means not knowing. And what's worse is, there's one thing to not know. There's another thing to know that you don't know. And there's another thing that you don't want to know. And that is the problem that we are facing. There's a lot of don't want to know mind. In Zen, there's one of the great Korean Zen masters used to talk about don't know mind. And he said, it's a good thing not to know. It's a good thing to know that you don't know. Because if you know that you don't know, and you realize that it's important that you do know, you will inquire, you'll ask questions, you'll investigate. And you don't just take an easy answer, something that's spoon-fed to you. So here we are, and we're watching the major media, and there's all kinds of, you could call it interesting, although that's a polite word to use. But I'll give you several examples. So you have there was just an interview with Donald Trump meeting with Friedrich Merz of the Chancellor of Germany. Just as an aside, there was a television program called I Love Lucy, and it was about this couple, Lucy. What was her name? I forget her last name. Lucille Ball, otherwise known as Lucy, and her husband Desi Arnaz. But they have this couple that lives in the floor above them in their apartment, named Fred and Ethel Merz. So it's Friedrich Merz. It was on I Love Lucy, the TV show, and I'm kind of wondering now. I have to admit that this guy Merz, who was meeting with Trump, is a lot taller and a lot thinner than the guy Friedrich Merz, who is on I Love Lucy. But it just kind of tickles me that this character that is on a TV show is also the chancellor of a major European country. Maybe Friedrich Merz is actually a fairly common name. I don't know. If it were named Friedrich Schmerz meaning suffering, that would be even better. But be that as it may. So there we are with Donald Trump talking with reporters, and he says, people ask him, how are you going to deal with, Putin and everything? And he says, well, you got to understand, I blew up Nord Stream pipeline. And and you wonder, where did he come up with that? And why did you think that Merz would kind of like go, what? Are you kidding? If Merz had any balls, he would have said, listen, Mr. Trump, President Trump, there was a news conference where Joseph Biden is with my predecessor, Schultz, Olaf Scholz, and he said that he was going to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline if Russia invaded Ukraine. So how can you, Donald Trump, tell me, the new Chancellor of Germany, that you blew up the pipeline when you had no authority to do so, you were not in a position to do so? Why do you take credit for doing something which is really an act of war, but you think it's good? So we're talking about ignorance within ignorance within ignorance on the part of Donald Trump. It's just really amazing. So I was listening to a couple of podcasts today. One is with Pepe Escobar. Now, Pepe Escobar, as I call him a Taoist monk. He and I are friends, and we've kind of communicated. He's in a class by himself, but he knows me. And we just, by chance, we met in May in Moscow. And so we're talking, and he says, "Oh, my Buddhist monk friend," and I say, "Oh, my Taoist monk friend," because Taoism and Buddhism are like they're cousins, so to speak, in terms of Chinese philosophy. So, but he's an extremely insightful person, and he was saying, he's kind of pessimistic. He doesn't think that much can come out of this because of the level of delusion that the collective West is in. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson is another, really excellent commentator. What I appreciate about him and other colonels, there are two other colonels. One is Daniel Davis, and another one is Colonel Doug McGregor. And all three of these guys have, I believe, they've been in combat, so they know what war is about. They know how terrible it can be. And some transformation occurred in them. And since they've become, civilians, they've been asking questions and questioning the system itself and calling out the system for its lies and the problems that are inherent with it. So so I was just saying that Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson was saying, he doesn't have much hope here because the people who are running Washington are incompetent, and their mentality is not conducive towards real negotiation, towards diplomacy, and the problem is that they're running a country that is armed with thousands of nuclear weapons, and because of their incompetence and their undeveloped, you could say, that to put it charitably, undeveloped mental maturity, their mentality, they're unpredictable. You don't know what they're going to do. So he was saying, and I agree, and other people are saying the same thing, we are closer to a nuclear war now than we ever have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Just to give you an example, what I'm talking about here, in case you don't know, in 1962, the United States had placed nuclear-capable missiles in Turkey. And Turkey, of course, is right across the Black Sea from Russia, from the Soviet Union at the time. They could probably have hit Moscow within 15 minutes. And when Khrushchev, who's the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, found out about this, he just thought, we got to do something about this. And at the same time, there had been a revolution in Cuba and overthrown the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Batista, and Fidel Castro was then the president of Cuba, a revolutionary government. And of course, the U.S. was extremely hostile to them. They tried to invade once, and with President Kennedy countermanding the plan of Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who, I should mention, Allen Dulles was collaborating with Nazis during World War II and after World War II, along with other American industrialists. So there's this kind of a Nazi mentality that's deeply embedded in the American leadership class. So that was in 1962. And of course, a year later, when Kennedy and Khrushchev actually worked it out and managed to, what happened was, Khrushchev placed missiles in the United States. They say, fine, you want to put missiles in Turkey, we'll put missiles in Cuba. And when the United States found out about it, they went ballistic. How dare you put missiles? Well, the United States, just because you think it's okay for you to put nuclear missiles and threaten the Soviet Union with 15 minutes warning that it's going to get, obliterated, why do you think it's not okay for us to do it? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. And of course, Kennedy had the spiritual maturity to work it out with Khrushchev, who also, obviously had some degree of that as well. So now, and what followed, you see, is that major scare, that actually was a wake-up call. And Kennedy went on a campaign. He went on a tour of the United States saying, look, we really need nuclear treaties. We need treaties that will protect us from going into a crazy arms race, which will cause us to, eventually reach the point where they'll get used. And fortunately, they had several of these arms control treaties throughout the years. There was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. There was the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and there was the START Treaty, and there was an INF Treaty. So there's 4 treaties, I guess that would be, that were kind of keeping the nuclear war potential under control. However, now I believe that the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is still more or less operative. In other words, although it was not, I believe it was not actually fully ratified by that was ratified. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was ratified, and nobody has, to our knowledge, has conducted nuclear tests. But the ABM Treaty that was negotiated in 1972, and the George W. Bush administration trashed that treaty. And what they did? They put quote-unquote anti-ballistic missiles right on Russia's borders. Oh, we're not worried about you guys. We're worried about Iran's intercontinental ballistic missiles. And Russia's saying, come on now, Iran does not have intercontinental ballistic missiles. You're putting these in here because you want to take out any retaliation that we would commit if you guys stage a first strike, because your idea is to shoot a bunch of nuclear missiles, destroy our country, and when we try to retaliate, the anti-ballistic missiles will knock them down, and you will get away scot-free, so to speak, or at least with a lot less damage than would happen to the Soviet Union or now Russia. So there was that anti-ballistic missile treaty that got trashed, and then in 1987 or 88, Ronald Reagan, who was another hawk, he was calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, which is rather ironic because the United States has overthrown multiple democratic governments and assassinated people, but Russia's the evil empire. We're the good guys. So this is an example of this kind of split consciousness that I'm trying to talk about here. So anyway, so here's Trump, and he had another statement where he's saying, we really don't like the fact that he was insulting India and Russia as having dead economies. So the deputy, I think, what is he called? The deputy Minister of Security, something like that, for the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev. He gives a counter tweet to, this is all taking place on, this is what do we call this, diplomacy by tweet. This is ridiculous. But anyway, so Trump is threatening him, threatening Russia and insulting Russia, and Dmitry Medvedev makes reference to something called the dead hand. So the dead hand was created by the Soviet Union so that if there was a decapitating strike against the Soviet Union, if there were no signals from either the political or the military leadership for some period of time, there would be signals that would pick up that fact, and as a result, there would be missiles launched with the codes to stage a massive counterattack on the United States. In other words, the Soviets and now Russians were saying, Dmitry Medvedev is saying, even if you think that you can destroy our country, even if we're all dead, we're going to be able to retaliate anyway. So this is in case of a first strike by the United States. So what does Trump do? He says, oh, you're threatening us. Well, Medvedev is saying, if you destroy our country, we'll get you back even after we're dead. And Trump answers this by saying, we're going to place nuclear submarines next to Russia so that we can, respond to your threat. But he's threatening with a first strike against what Russia is calling a retaliatory strike. So this is another example of, what are these guys thinking? Then you have, I was mentioning Colonel Wilkerson and Daniel Davis and Doug McGregor, and all three of them are, they have military backgrounds, and so it's not like they're flaming radicals, political radicals on the far left. They're basically, they're military people, but they understand reality. They're living in reality, and so they've all been warning that that the situation that Ukraine is losing, that Ukraine instigated at the behest of the United States, instigated this war in the first place. It was not provoked. Russia did not invade unprovoked. It was very clearly provoked. They did everything they could to provoke Russia. They made it impossible for Russia not to invade Ukraine, because the government in Ukraine, in Kiev, was the result of a coup staged by the United States, and then these people were armed to the teeth, and they were killing people in eastern Ukraine. So this brings me to Zelensky. Zelensky just said that they're not going to give up the Donbass, but they're killing the people in Donbass. So what is it? Is it they just want the land, but they hate the people. They hate their own people who are Ukrainians, but they're Russian-speaking Ukrainians. You see, so you've got this aspect of deep hatred towards anything Russian, both within Ukraine as well as towards Russia as a country. This is another example. Speaking of ignorance, does hatred really work? In the long term? Even Martin Luther King talked about this. He said, if you have hatred doesn't win, love wins. But this is the state of the Western mentality that is going on not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe, and also in the United States. So the question is, what do we do about this? And speaking of this Israeli friend that I have, we met last weekend, and we were talking over coffee for several hours. And he's a very, very fine person, and he's also practices Buddhism. And we both agreed on a philosophical level that the cause of suffering is ignorance. If you don't know what's going on, then whenever something that goes against your expectations doesn't work, there's going to be consequence. You're going to suffer, And even Vladimir Putin, said recently, we have to realize that things may not go according to expectations. So Vladimir Putin is speaking the same kind of philosophical language which I'm talking about. So I'm talking with my Israeli friend, and I say, do you follow? He knows that the Israeli public is brainwashed. He understands that terrible things are happening there, but I don't think he really understands the history of why things are the way they are. And so, and I said to him, do you watch the news? And he said, no, I don't watch the news. I said, you mean you don't know that Benjamin Netanyahu just compared the Palestinians to the Amaleks of the Bible, and that was basically a symbol, a signal that Israelis have the right to slaughter Palestinians the way the Israelites who came to Palestine back, after they left Egypt and were slaves in Egypt, according to the story. It's probably a myth, but this is how people understand it. They go there. God says to the Israelites, "You can kill anybody you want because I'm giving this land to you." I mean, so this is what kind of mentality is this? So, but I said, "You don't know this?" He said, "No, I don't watch the news." There was another Israeli that I met a few years ago, and we were talking philosophy, and I said, what do you, we were talking about truth. And he says, I don't want to know the truth. Well, why don't you want to know the truth? Well, because if I know the truth, I won't be happy. It may be painful for me to hear. And I'm thinking, well, if you wonder why your country is in the midst of a serious war, and you just got thousands of, Iran just, taught you a little lesson because you were ignorant about the fact that Iran could actually defend itself. That's an example of ignorance. You pick a fight with somebody you think you can bully, and it turns out that they're a lot stronger than you were. Why even pick the fight at all? Why do you have to assume that Palestinians are human animals? They're inferior to yourselves. Why can't you treat them with respect and build a country together? Why didn't you do that back in 1948 instead of this ignorant idea that you're somehow superior to everybody else? It's not just Israel that does this, it's the United States that does this. We have this idea of manifest destiny, where God gave us the right to sweep across the North American continent, and when we were done genociding the Indians, because they're also merciless red-skinned savages, as our Declaration of Independence called them, we have the right to conquer the world. Do we really? Do we really have the capability of doing it, even if we want to? This is ignorance. They're living in delusion, and how are we going to deal with this? So I was, I was watching Colonel Wilkeson and listening to Pepe Escobar, and it brought a phrase to my mind which I have asked myself for many, many years. Back, after the phony election of George W. Bush, that was a stolen election in the year 2000. And, of course, 9/11 happened immediately after that. And the fingerprints of the CIA and Mossad are all over that. And I'm just seeing the country going in a really bad direction. And then when 2004 came around, I was on the campaign for Dennis Kucinich, who was the peace candidate within the Democratic Party at that time. And he was a great person. I went to several of his campaign stops, and at one point I got right up to his ear, and I said, "What's going on with you? Who are you? You seem to understand things better than other people. Why is that?" And he whispered into my ear. I think I can say it now, because he's retired. He said, Agni Yoga. The guy's, he's practicing yoga. He's practicing a deep spiritual practice to transform our consciousness. That is the solution to our problem. We need to transform our consciousness. So that's what we need to do. Interestingly enough, I was listening to another podcast with Regis Tremblay, who's a great, fantastic person. He lives in Yalta in the Russian Federation, and he was interviewing a friend of his named Ed Curtin, who's a retired professor, and they were talking about the significance of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This is August 14th, and on August 6th, it's barely a week ago, it was the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in Japan, and then 3 days later was the attack on Nagasaki. A couple of 100,000 people die. Massive suffering goes on for decades afterwards, and Harry Truman said, "Well, we did it to save lives, because we were afraid that we were going to have to invade Japan in order to, win the war." Well, that was a lie, because American generals were saying that Japan was on the verge of capitulating, on the verge of surrender, and the sticking point was that the Americans wanted to completely redo the government, and the Japanese were saying we'll surrender, but we want to keep the emperor. And so they weren't reaching this surrender agreement. But what happened was that the Soviet Union had an agreement with the Americans and the British that 3 months after the war in Europe ended, with the victory of the Allies, especially the Soviet Union, which did 80% of the fighting, they agreed that they would go and attack Japan in China. So, of course, the Soviet Union is contiguous with China, and with particularly this area called Manchuria. And the Soviet army was near the border, and there was 1 million Japanese. This is like one of the best trained branches of the Japanese army at that time, Kwangtung Army, and the Soviets, basically rolled over them, and it was such a dramatic defeat for the Japanese. They were basically wiped out, and their army was either wiped out or surrendered within, I think, like 2 weeks. The Japanese realized we'll accept America's terms. Why? Because we're a fascist country. Look what we've done for the last, since 1937. We've caused mayhem. We've taken over countries' resources. We've been brutal, and we've been proud of ourselves for doing it. This is an example of a fascist country that was in control of Japan at that time. And of course, what is the biggest enemy of fascism? It's socialism. And the Soviet Union had defeated the fascists in Europe, all of them, the Germans, the Italians, the Hungarians, Bulgarians. There were more than one fascist army in Europe during World War II. It wasn't like Germany had attacked the Soviet Union by itself. There was a number of countries that did it. But in case of Japan, here's Japan. They were occupying large areas of China, and when the Japanese saw that the Soviet army was basically on the way, they were going to invade the island of Japan and take it over, and they didn't want that. So they said, okay, we'll surrender to the Americans. But did any of you learn any of this in your history classes? Probably not. So this is another example of how ignorance plays such a huge role in human behavior. It's not just on our own individual lives where we have a disagreement with a person, and we if we're wise enough, we'll work it out and say, oh, I didn't understand. I didn't realize your point of view, and I need to understand this. And it works that way in interpersonal relations. It works that way within ourselves. if we, are suffering psychologically for some reason, if we look deeply within ourselves and say, oh, so why do I feel that way? And then you realize, oh, it's because of such and such, something that I did in the past or something that happened to me. And how do I, how do I forgive that other person, or how do I forgive myself for doing something that I shouldn't have done? This is the kind of psychological internal discourse that you can have with yourself, but also with other people. So the question arose, when Trump meets Putin, what is Putin going to say to this ignoramus? Ideally, Putin would say, Donald, you're a great guy, and we'd love to do business with you in the Arctic. We know that you're really about making money, but there's this problem. You claim you blew up the pipeline. Well, you didn't do that. Well, we'll forgive you for that because that wasn't your job. That wasn't your doing. That was Joe Biden's doing. But you did give Javelin missiles to the Ukrainians. You did build up their military by several times, so that they were in a position where they could stage a massive attack on the Donbass and ultimately on Russia. So your attitude towards us has not been, friendly. Regardless, that you can say, "Oh yeah, Putin and I got along real great. I'm trying to destroy Russia, but other than that, Putin and I got along real great." Trump, you're going to have to do a little bit better than that. So, how about reopening our consulates, which were shut down summarily? That was by Biden. And why don't you return the $300 billion that you have that were in U.S. banks that you've gotten control of, and you've been using that to fund weapons purchases that are killing Russian soldiers? And why don't you stop using your satellite capabilities to keep this fascist regime going? You don't know that it was Joe Biden and Obama that staged a coup in 2014 that caused a civil war in Ukraine with the purpose of drawing in Russia so that you could inflict sanctions on Russia in the hopes that you could destroy our economy, and with the eventual goal of taking me personally down so that you could put in traitors within Russia to do what Boris Yeltsin did during the 1990s. Cooperate while our country, Russia, was being raped. So you got a lot of work to do, Donald Trump, and you Americans, you've got a lot of work to do, and you Europeans, you've got a lot of work to do. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, when we say we need to denazify and demilitarize the country, we're talking about you withdrawing the support that you gave to these neo-Nazis, just like you've given support to ISIS, just like you gave support to Al-Qaeda. Let me ask you a question, President Trump. Why do you say that you're for freedom and democracy when you support the most violent, the most dangerous terrorist groups in many different countries, and you overthrow democratic governments? There's a disconnect here. I think there's some ignorance that's going on in your brain. What is going on with this? So please do some introspection and show some empathy for our position. And then when you do that kind of internal work, then we can have a discussion about these other things. But the first thing you need to do is you need to look at yourself. So if I were in Putin's shoes, I would say something like that. It's very difficult for me, how presumptuous is it for me, a nobody, living in Thailand, to advise the U.S. president, or I could advise the U.S. president what he should do, and I would advise President Trump what he should do, But who am I? I'm just a nobody. All I am is an observer. I'm somebody who questions. My goal is to minimize ignorance, maximize enlightenment, and And that is the way out of our current predicament. We have to face reality. After 9/11, there was a woman who had been a whistleblower in the U.S. government, and when she blew the whistle, the U.S. government fought back, and she lost her career. They don't like truth in the U.S. government, especially corrupt people who are making millions of dollars on corruption. Well, she said, if we can face it, God can fix it. And that's really what it comes down to. We have to face reality. And it's a real question whether the U.S. or Europe or Israel or the leadership class in England is able to do that. I really don't know if they can do that. We are seeing some rising of consciousness within England, where you had a massive crowd of young people, supporting the Palestinian cause, and the government is completely opposed to that. It shows the really totalitarian nature, the true nature of the British government. It's run by fascists essentially, who are repressing the country, repressing the people, taking away more and more of their benefits, their social benefits, and sending it off to war. So it's going to take some kind of really radical change in the government in all of those countries in order to change. But in order to do that, the people have to have a massive increase in consciousness. That's what my channel is all about. So thank you for listening, and as events develop, I'm sure I'll have some comments on what happens following the conference between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, and hopefully something good will come out of it. But I think we shouldn't have too high expectations. So again, thanks for listening. If you can support my channel by making a donation through PayPal or through Buy Me a Coffee, or making a subscription to my Substack, that would be really great. Or you can buy a T-shirt. So thanks again, and I'll catch you soon.